We all carry memories of someone who changed us when we were too young to understand what love really meant. For most of us, those childhood promises fade with time, but some men spend their whole lives trying to keep them. Colby Rain was 14 when he met Juniper Cade in a mountain town where nobody stayed long. She was wild and free, with a musket on her shoulder and secrets in her eyes. When she saved him from a bar fight, he told her he loved her. She just smiled and said, "Find me when you're older, kid." Then she vanished into the wilderness. 10 years passed. Colby came back from war carrying wounds that wouldn't heal. With nothing but her memory, he rode back to those mountains to find her. But would the woman he discovered still be the wild spirit he remembered? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Cedar Falls had never been much to look at, even in its better days. Nestled in a narrow valley between two ridges of pine-covered mountains, it existed for one reason: the silver mine that had played out 3 years before young Colby Rain turned 14. What remained was a collection of weathered buildings, a handful of stubborn families, and the constant whisper of wind through empty spaces where prosperity once lived. Samuel Rain's blacksmith shop sat at the heart of what passed for the town's Main Street, its brick chimney the tallest structure for miles around. The rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil had been the town's heartbeat for as long as anyone could remember, and Samuel took quiet pride in being the one constant in a place where most folks came and went like seasonal weather. His son Colby had grown up to that sound, learning the weight of iron and the patience required to shape something useful from raw metal. At 14, the boy was tall for his age but still lean, with hands that were starting to show the calluses of honest work. His father's blacksmith hammer, a tool that had belonged to Samuel's father before him, felt heavy in Colby's grip, but he was learning to trust its weight. "Metal tells you what it wants to become," Samuel would say, watching his son work the bellows. "Your job isn't to force it. Your job is to listen." Colby's mother, Martha, ran the general store attached to their living quarters, a cramped but comfortable space that smelled of coffee beans, leather goods, and the lavender soap she made from plants gathered in the meadows above town. She was a practical woman who'd married Samuel for his steadiness rather than romance, though over the years she'd grown genuinely fond of his quiet wisdom and gentle hands. The boy took after his father in temperament, thoughtful, observant, slow to anger, but he had his mother's restless eyes. While Samuel seemed content to measure his days by the work at hand, Colby would often pause in his tasks to stare up at the mountain ridges that surrounded their valley, as if expecting something to emerge from the green shadows of the high country. "That boy's got wandering in his blood," old Pete Hutchins would say, chuckling over his morning coffee in Martha's store. Pete was the closest thing Cedar Falls had to a historian, a grizzled former prospector who'd stayed on after the mine. Closed because he'd grown too attached to the mountains to leave. He knew every trail within 50 miles and could read weather patterns like scripture. "All young men get restless," Martha would reply, but there was worry in her voice. She'd seen what the mountains could do to dreamers. 3 times a week, Colby would load their supply wagon and make the day-long journey to Millerville, the larger settlement 20 miles south, where the railroad still stopped twice a week. It was honest work, hauling tools that needed repair, delivering Martha's soap and preserves to the mercantile there, bringing back supplies that couldn't be made or grown locally. The road to Millerville was little more than wagon ruts carved into the mountainside, winding through stands of aspen and pine, crossing 3 creeks that ran fast with snowmelt in spring and barely trickled by late summer. Colby had traveled it so often he could navigate it in his sleep, but he never tired of the journey. Each bend offered new views of the high peaks, and sometimes he'd spot deer or elk grazing in the meadows, or catch glimpses of the hawks that rode the thermals above the tree line. It was on one of these trips, in the early days of September, when the aspens were just beginning to turn gold, that Colby first heard stories about the woman who lived somewhere up in the high country. "Seen her twice myself," said Tom Bradley, the storekeeper in Millerville, as he helped Colby load supplies into the wagon. "Tall woman, maybe 30 years old, always carries a rifle. Dresses like a man but moves like a dancer. Some say she's got a cabin up near Thunder Lake. Others claim she just sleeps under the stars." "What's her name?" Colby asked, trying to sound casual. "Juniper Cade, if the stories are true. Used to be married to a cavalry officer. From what I hear, he died in some Indian fighting down in Arizona Territory, and she came north afterward. That was maybe 5 years ago." Tom lowered his voice conspiratorially. "They say she can track anything that walks, shoot the eye out of a squirrel at 100 yards, and knows every plant that grows between here and Canada. Mountain woman, through and through. Not the kind you'd want to cross, but not the kind to cause trouble either, if you leave her be." The description lodged in Colby's imagination like a splinter. On the ride home, he found himself scanning the ridgelines more carefully, wondering if she might be watching from some hidden vantage point. The idea of someone choosing to live, completely free, answering to no one and nothing but their own will, seemed impossibly romantic to a boy who'd never spent a night away from his parents' house. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Samuel, Martha, and Colby in the same chairs they'd occupied for years, the boy worked up the courage to ask about Juniper Cade. Samuel paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "You been talking to Tom Bradley again? He mentioned someone living up in the high country. A woman on her own." Martha and Samuel exchanged one of those looks that passed between married couples, full of unspoken communication. "There's always been folks who choose the mountains over towns," Samuel said carefully. "Most of them have their reasons. Best to respect that choice and not pry into business that isn't ours. But isn't it dangerous? A woman alone up there." Samuel set down his fork and looked at his son with the patient expression he wore when explaining something important. "Son, there's different kinds of dangerous. Yes, the mountains can kill you if you're careless or unlucky, but some people find more danger in towns than they ever would in the wilderness." "Your father's right," Martha added, "and from what I've heard, this Juniper woman knows the mountains better than most men know their own farms. She's not some helpless thing that needs rescuing." But Colby's imagination was already running wild with possibilities. That night, lying in his narrow bed and listening to the familiar sounds of his parents settling in for sleep, he stared out his window at the moonlit peaks and wondered what it would be like to meet someone who'd chosen complete freedom over the safety of civilization. He had no way of knowing that within a week he'd have his answer. Old Pete had been right about Colby having wandering in his blood, but what none of them understood, not Samuel with his steady wisdom, not Martha with her practical concern, not even Colby himself, was that the boy wasn't just restless for adventure. He was searching for something he couldn't yet name, some missing piece that would make sense of the yearning he felt every time he looked up at those mountain ridges. In the general store, among the familiar smells of coffee and leather and his mother's lavender soap, surrounded by the only life he'd ever known, Colby Rain was growing into a young man who sensed there was something larger waiting for him beyond the narrow confines of Cedar Falls. He just didn't know yet that it would come in the form of a woman who belonged more to the wilderness than to any town, and that meeting her would change the entire course of his life. The mountains, as old Pete liked to say, had their own way of giving a man exactly what he needed, whether he was ready for it or not. The blacksmith's hammer that had shaped 3 generations of Rain men would continue its work, but the boy who wielded it was about to discover that some things couldn't be forged with iron and fire. They had to be earned through courage, patience, and the willingness to follow a promise into the unknown. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late September, when 3 drifters rode into Millerville, looking like they'd been traveling hard for weeks. Colby noticed them as he unloaded his wagon outside Bradley's store. Lean, unwashed men, with the hollow eyes of those who'd been living rough. Their horses were better cared for than they were, which told him something about their priorities. He was securing a load of iron stock and finished tools for the return trip when he heard raised voices from Murphy's saloon across the street. Through the batwing doors, he could see one of the drifters backing a smaller man against the bar, while the other two flanked him like wolves. "I told you, I don't have that kind of money," the cornered man was saying, his voice high with fear. Colby recognized him, Jimmy Morrison, a clerk from the railroad office who barely made enough to feed his family. Whatever debt he'd incurred, it wasn't something he could settle with violence. The smart thing would have been to mind his own business. Samuel had raised him to be helpful, but not foolish. These were grown men's problems, and Colby was still just a boy, hauling supplies for his father's blacksmith shop. But something about the way the three drifters had positioned themselves, predators playing with prey, made his stomach turn. And when the largest of them grabbed Morrison's shirt front and lifted him clean off his feet, Colby found himself pushing through the saloon doors before he'd consciously decided to move. "Leave him be," he said, his voice carrying more authority than he felt. The three men turned toward him with the lazy interest of cats spotting a mouse. The leader, a scarred man with tobacco-stained teeth, smiled without warmth. "Well, look what we got here. Boy thinks he's a man. I said leave him." "Be?" Colby repeated, his hand instinctively moving to the hammer at his belt. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was solid iron, and he knew how to use it. The leader released Morrison, who slumped against the bar, gasping. "You got business with us, boy?" "Just passing through," Colby said carefully. "Same as you. Don't." "Didn't think so." The man stepped closer, and Colby could smell whiskey and unwashed clothes. "Think you're some kind of hero? Think you can come in here and tell us our business?" The other two were moving to flank him now, cutting off his retreat to the door. Colby's heart hammered against his ribs, but he stood his ground. Sometimes a man had to choose between safety and what was right, and his father had taught him that the choosing itself was what made the difference between a boy and a man. "I think three grown men shouldn't need to gang up on one railroad clerk," he said quietly. That's when the first punch came, catching him across the jaw and sending him staggering into a table. Chairs scattered, and he heard Morrison cry out as the other drifters moved in. Colby rolled away from a boot aimed at his ribs and came up swinging the hammer, managing to clip one of them across the shoulder hard enough to make him yelp. But 3 against 1 was poor odds, especially when the three had been fighting for their lives longer than Colby had been breathing. He took another punch to the gut that doubled him over and was preparing for the boot that would likely crack his skull when the saloon doors exploded inward. "That's enough." The voice was clear, calm, and completely female. Every man in the saloon froze, including the three drifters, who turned toward the entrance with expressions of surprise. Colby looked up from the floor and felt his breath catch in his throat. She stood in the doorway like something out of a frontier legend, tall and lean and perfectly still. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, pulled back in a practical braid that hung over one shoulder. She wore men's clothing, leather pants, a blue work shirt, boots that had seen hard use, but there was nothing masculine about the way she carried herself. A rifle rested casually in the crook of her left arm, and her right hand hung loose and ready at her side. But it was her eyes that held everyone's attention. They were the green of deep forest shade, and they held the kind of confidence that came from facing real danger and walking away. "Boy's not your concern," the leader said, but his voice had lost its swagger. "Wasn't talking to you," she replied, never taking her eyes off him. "I was talking to the boy." She stepped into the saloon, and Colby could see the way the drifters tensed, uncertain how to handle this unexpected development. Women didn't typically intervene in barroom fights, especially not women who looked like they knew how to use the rifles they carried. "You hurt bad?" she asked Colby, still watching the three men. "I'll live," he managed, pushing himself to his feet. His jaw throbbed and his ribs ached, but nothing felt broken. "Good. Morrison, you can stop hiding behind that bar now. These gentlemen were just leaving." The leader's hand moved toward the pistol at his hip, but stopped when the barrel of her rifle shifted almost imperceptibly in his direction. It wasn't pointed at him exactly, but the threat was clear enough. "We got business to finish," he said. "No," she replied calmly. "You don't." For a long moment, the saloon held its breath. Then the leader seemed to deflate slightly, recognizing something in her stillness that warned him against pushing further. "This ain't over," he muttered, but he was already backing toward the door. "Yes," she said quietly, "it is." The three drifters filed out like whipped dogs, and a collective sigh of relief went around the saloon. Morrison slumped against the bar, shaking, while the handful of other patrons began talking in low, excited voices about what they'd just witnessed. But Colby only had eyes for the woman who'd rescued them all. She turned toward him, and for the first time he got a clear look at her face. She was older than him, maybe 25 or 30, with laugh lines around her eyes and a small scar along her left cheekbone that spoke of past adventures. Her skin was tanned from years in the sun, and her hands looked strong and capable. "Let's get you cleaned up," she said, slinging the rifle across her back with practiced ease. She led him to a table in the back corner, away from the curious eyes of the other patrons, and produced a small leather pouch from her pocket. Inside were strips of clean cloth and a bottle of something that smelled strongly of alcohol and herbs. "This might sting," she warned, dampening a cloth with the liquid. She was right. When she pressed it to the cut on his lip, Colby hissed and jerked back instinctively. But her touch was gentle, and she worked with the efficiency of someone who'd patched up injuries before. "You're Juniper Cade," he said, surprising himself with his boldness. She paused in her ministrations, one eyebrow rising slightly. "Am I?" "Now, Tom Bradley told me about you, said you lived up in the high country. Tom Bradley talks too much." But there was amusement in her voice rather than annoyance. "Why did you help me?" She finished cleaning his cuts and sat back, studying him with those remarkable green eyes. 3 against 1 isn't much of a fight, more like slaughter. I could have handled it." She smiled at that, and the expression transformed her entire face. "I'm sure you could have eventually, but sometimes it's better to end a thing quick and clean rather than let it drag out bloody. I'm Colby Rain," he said, extending his hand. She shook it with a grip that was firm without being showy. "Pleasure to meet you, Colby Rain." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Colby found himself studying her face, trying to memorize every detail. There was something about her that seemed to pull at him, a magnetism he'd never experienced before. "I think I love you," he blurted out, then immediately felt his face burn with embarrassment. Instead of laughing or looking offended, Juniper Cade just smiled that transforming smile again. "You're a good boy, Colby Rain," she said gently, reaching out to tip his hat back slightly. "But you're still a boy. Find me when you're older, kid." She stood up, shouldered her rifle, and walked toward the saloon doors with that easy, confident stride. At the threshold, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. "Take care of yourself," she said. Then she stepped out into the afternoon. Sunlight and vanished as suddenly as she'd appeared. Colby sat at the table for a long time afterward, touching the tender spot on his lip where she'd cleaned his cut, watching the empty doorway where she'd stood. When he finally gathered himself enough to finish loading his wagon and head back to Cedar Falls, he kept looking over his shoulder at the mountains, wondering where she'd gone. He had no way of knowing it would be 10 years before he saw her again. The obsession began innocently enough. In the weeks following the encounter at Murphy's saloon, Colby found himself paying closer attention to the stories that drifted down from the high country. Every supply run to Millerville became an opportunity to gather information about Juniper Cade, though he tried to keep his questions casual. She helped old Mrs. Patterson when her husband took sick last month, Tom Bradley mentioned one afternoon as they loaded Colby's wagon. Brought down herbs that broke his fever when nothing else would work. Wouldn't take any payment, just asked Mrs. Patterson to keep quiet about where the medicine came from. Another time, it was the story of how she'd tracked down the miller. Families missing cattle when they'd wandered off during an early snowstorm, leading them back to safety through whiteout conditions that would have defeated most experienced woodsmen. Mountain Angel, some folks call her, said Pete Morrison. Jimmy's older brother who worked as a surveyor. Others just call her Ghost. Where she can appear and disappear without a trace, you'd think she was made of mist. Colby started keeping a journal, a leather-bound book his mother had given him for his birthday. Instead of writing about his daily routine or his thoughts, he filled it with sketches, mountain paths he'd seen, wildflowers that reminded him of her green eyes, landscapes where he imagined she might have passed. His artistic skills were modest, but the act of drawing helped him feel connected to something larger than the narrow confines of Cedar Falls. More importantly, he began spending his free time learning skills he'd never needed before. Old Pete. Hutchins became his reluctant teacher, showing him how to read tracks in soft earth, how to identify edible plants, and how to move quietly through the forest. "Why the sudden interest in woodcraft?" Pete asked one evening as they sat by the creek that ran behind the blacksmith shop. "Planning to become a mountain man yourself?" Colby had prepared an answer for that question. "Just seems like useful knowledge. Never know when you might need to find your way in the wilderness." Pete studied him, with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. This wouldn't have anything to do with a certain green-eyed woman who's got half the territory talking. "Would it?" Heat rose in Colby's cheeks, but he kept his voice steady. "I just want to learn." "Uh-huh." Pete took a long draw from his pipe. "Well, I suppose there are worse reasons to develop outdoor skills. But boy, you need to understand something about folks who choose the wilderness over civilization. They usually do it for reasons that run deeper than romance." Over the following months, Colby made several expeditions into the foothills. Always with the excuse of gathering firewood or checking snares Pete had taught him to set. He never found any sign of juniper, but he learned the country around Cedar Falls like he'd never known it before. Every game trail, every water source, every sheltered spot where someone might choose to camp. It was on one of these expeditions, in late spring when the wildflowers were blooming in the high meadows, that he found his first real clue. The campsite was old, probably abandoned for weeks, but someone had lived there for a while. The fire ring was carefully constructed, the sleeping area sheltered by an overhanging rock face, and there were signs of systematic hunting and gathering, cleaned animal bones, berry stains on flat rocks, holes where edible roots had been dug. What caught his attention was a piece of carved wood hanging from a tree branch nearby. It was a flute crafted from what looked like birch wood, with simple but elegant finger holes and a design of leaves and vines etched along its length. When he held it up to the light, he could see the craftsmanship was excellent. The work of someone with both skill and patience. He almost took it, then thought better of it. Instead, he made a careful sketch in his journal and left the flute where he'd found it. If it belonged to Juniper, and his instinct said it did, then taking it would be theft. But finding it meant he was learning to read the signs she left behind. That night at dinner, he worked up the courage to ask his parents directly about Juniper Cade. "The stories make her sound almost mythical," he said, trying to keep his tone light, "like she's not quite human." Samuel set down his fork and gave his son the look that meant a serious conversation was coming. "What kind of stories?" "Healing herbs, tracking skills, appearing and disappearing like smoke. People talk about her like she's some kind of spirit. Of the mountains. People like to make legends out of things they don't understand," Martha said gently. "Especially when it comes to women who don't fit into neat categories." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Samuel said slowly, "that a woman living alone in the wilderness makes folks uncomfortable. They either have to make her into a saint or a devil to make sense of it. Truth is probably somewhere in between." "Did you know her husband?" Colby asked. "The cavalry officer who died?" His parents exchanged another of their meaningful looks. "We knew of him," Martha said finally. "Captain James Cade, stationed at Fort Collins before he was transferred to Arizona Territory. He came through Cedar Falls a few times on patrol, maybe 6 or 7 years ago." What was he like? Seemed like a decent enough man, Samuel said carefully. But there were stories about him too, about his temper, especially when he'd been drinking. Some men don't take well to marriage, son. They think owning a wife is the same as owning a horse. The implication hit Colby like a physical blow. He hurt her? We don't know that for certain, Martha said quickly. But when a woman chooses to live alone in the wilderness after her husband dies, it makes you wonder what she's trying to get away from. That night, lying in his narrow bed and staring up at the moonlit peaks, Colby felt his admiration for Juniper Cade deepen into something more complex. The romantic fantasy of the mysterious mountain woman was giving way to a more mature understanding. She wasn't just choosing freedom, she was choosing safety. The wilderness wasn't her prison, it was her sanctuary. The realization made him more determined than ever to prove himself worthy of her notice. Not as a lovesick boy with impossible dreams, but as a man who could understand why someone would choose solitude over the complications of civilization. He began pushing himself harder in his wilderness expeditions, learning to move quietly enough, to observe deer without alarming them, to find water by reading the landscape, to build shelters that would keep him warm and dry through mountain storms. Pete noticed the change in his approach to woodcraft. "You're not playing around anymore," the old man observed, after Colby successfully tracked a wounded elk for 3 miles and put it out of its misery with a clean shot. "This is starting to look serious." "Maybe it is," Colby replied, field-dressing the animal with newfound skill. "Just remember, boy, becoming someone worthy of finding her and actually finding her are 2 different challenges entirely." But Colby was young and optimistic, and every skill he mastered felt like a step closer to the moment when he would see Juniper Cade again. He had no way of knowing that when that moment finally came, it would be under circumstances he couldn't possibly imagine, and that the woman he found would be both exactly what he expected and nothing like what he'd prepared for. The mountains, as Pete had warned him, had their own timeline for such things. By the time Colby turned 16, Cedar Falls felt like a coat that no longer fit properly. The town hadn't changed. If anything, it had grown smaller as more families moved away in search of better opportunities. But Colby had outgrown the narrow confines of his childhood world. The blacksmith shop that had once seemed like the center of the universe now felt like a cage, and the familiar rhythm of hammer on anvil had become as monotonous as a heartbeat. Samuel noticed the change in his son, though he was careful not to comment on it directly. The boy's work remained reliable, but his attention often wandered to the windows that looked out toward the high peaks. His sketching had improved considerably, but the subjects were always the same: mountain vistas, forest scenes, and studies of birds in flight that suggested a yearning for freedom. "He's got the look of a young man who's hearing distant drums," Martha confided to her husband one evening as they watched Colby standing on their front porch, staring up at the stars. "Same look his grandfather had at that age," Samuel replied, quietly. Right before he packed up and headed west to the goldfields, the conversation they'd both been dreading came on a cold morning in February, when news arrived that would change everything for the young men of the territory. A rider from the territorial capital brought word that recruiters would be coming through the region, seeking volunteers for the Union Army. The Civil War had been raging for 2 years, and President Lincoln needed every able-bodied man who could carry a rifle. "It's not our fight," Samuel said that evening, his voice heavy with the weight of experience. "Wars are started by politicians and fought by other men's sons." But Colby had been waiting for something like this, an opportunity to break free from the familiar patterns of his life, to test himself against challenges larger than anything Cedar Falls could offer. The war represented adventure, purpose, and the chance to become the kind of man who might be worthy of a woman like Juniper Cade. "Maybe it's time I found out what I'm made of," he said quietly. Samuel set down the piece of iron he'd been working and looked at his son with eyes that held old pain. "You want to know what war makes of men, Colby? It either breaks them completely or hardens them into something their families barely recognize. There's no middle ground. You fought in a war, Colby pointed out. You came back. Did I? Samuel's voice carried a bitterness Colby had never heard before. Sometimes I wonder. That night, after Colby had gone to bed, Samuel retrieved a wooden box from beneath the floorboards of their bedroom. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were documents he'd hoped never to show his son. Discharge papers from the Confederate Army, a medal for valor he'd never displayed, and letters from comrades who died in places with names like Shiloh and Antietam. The next morning, he sat Colby down at the kitchen table and spread the papers between them. I was 19 when I enlisted. In Virginia, Samuel said quietly. Thought I was going off to prove myself a man, maybe win some glory while I was at it. Came home 3 years later with a limp I still carry and dreams that wake me up sweating some nights. Colby stared at the papers, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything he'd thought he knew about his father. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because I hoped you'd never need to know. Because I wanted you to have a choice I didn't think I had. Samuel's hands, scarred from years of blacksmith work, trembled slightly as he refolded the documents. But if you're determined to go, then you need to understand what you're walking into. What did it change about you? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the mountains. Made me appreciate smaller things. This shop, your mother, the sound of ordinary conversations about ordinary problems. Made me understand that most of what passes for important in the world isn't important at all. But you don't regret it. I regret the necessity of it. I regret the boys who didn't come home. I regret the things I had to do to survive. He looked directly at his son. But I don't regret becoming the kind of man who could build a life worth protecting. When the recruiters arrived in Cedar Falls 2 weeks later, Colby was ready. He'd spent hours practicing with the old hunting rifle Samuel had reluctantly taught him to use, and he'd continued his wilderness training with Pete Hutchins, who seemed to understand that the boy was preparing for something more serious than weekend camping trips. You sure about this? Pete asked as they cleaned the rabbit Colby had shot cleanly through the head at 50 yards. I need to do something that matters, Colby replied. Something bigger than shoeing horses and repairing plowshares. Pellingy. Other men isn't necessarily bigger, son. Sometimes it's just louder. But Colby's mind was made up. On the day before he was scheduled to leave with the recruiting party, he made one final expedition into the high country. This time he climbed higher than he'd ever gone before, following game trails that led above the tree line into the realm of scattered boulders and stunted alpine plants. He didn't find Juniper, but as he stood on a wind-swept ridge looking out, over hundreds of miles of wilderness, he caught a glimpse of movement on a distant peak. Through the small brass spyglass Pete had lent him, he could make out a solitary figure standing silhouetted against the sky. Too far away to identify, but something about the stance and the stillness made his heart race. For just a moment, the figure seemed to turn in his direction, as if aware of being observed. Then it disappeared behind an outcropping of rock, leaving Colby to wonder if he'd seen anything at all, or if his yearning had created a vision where none existed. That night, he wrote his first real letter to Juniper Cade, though he had no way to deliver it. He poured out his feelings, his admiration for her strength and independence, his determination to become worthy of her notice, and his promise to return from whatever lay ahead. I know you told me to find you when I'm older, he wrote in his careful script. I'm going away to become that older man. When I come back, I hope I'll be someone you can see as an equal rather than a boy with foolish dreams. He sealed the letter in an envelope and left it in his journal, between sketches of mountain wildflowers and studies of soaring hawks. Then he packed his few belongings, said goodbye to parents who tried not to show their fear, and rode out of Cedar Falls with 12 other young men who thought they understood what they were volunteering for. As the familiar peaks receded behind him, Colby touched the compass Pete had given him as a farewell gift, a simple brass instrument that would always point him back toward home. But home, he realized, wasn't just a place anymore. It was a promise he'd made to himself and to a green-eyed woman who might or might not have been watching from a distant peak as he rode toward his uncertain future. 4 years of war changed a man in ways that couldn't be measured by calendars or scars. When Colby Rain rode back into Cedar Falls on a grey morning in late October, his parents almost didn't recognize the lean, weathered stranger who dismounted at their door. The boy who'd left at 16 with dreams of glory had been replaced by a 24-year-old man whose eyes held the weight of things that couldn't be shared over dinner conversation. His left shoulder carried a Union Army bullet that had never been properly removed, giving him a slight hitch in his movement when the weather turned cold. His hands, once smooth from working iron, now bore the calluses of a man who'd learned to survive with whatever tools came to hand. Most telling of all was the way he moved, always aware of his surroundings, never fully relaxed, as if part of him remained perpetually on guard against dangers that might emerge from any shadow. "My boy," Martha whispered, reaching up to touch the scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline. "What have they done to you?" Colby caught her hand gently before she could complete the gesture. His grip was firm but careful, the touch of someone who'd learned to modulate his strength around fragile things. "They made me grow up, Ma," he said quietly. "Nothing more or less than that." Samuel studied his son with the measuring gaze he'd once reserved for judging the temper of heated steel. What he saw was a man who'd been tested in ways no father wants to imagine, but who'd somehow retained the essential core of decency that made him recognizable as the boy who'd left 4 years earlier. "You hungry?" Samuel asked, because sometimes the simplest questions carried the most weight. "Always," Colby replied, and the ghost of a smile touched his lips for the first time since his return. Over the following weeks, Cedar Falls tried to reclaim its prodigal son, but the fit was awkward on both sides. The town had continued shrinking during the war years. 3 more families had moved on to larger settlements, and the general store now carried half the inventory it once had. What remained was a community of stubborn holdouts and elderly folks who'd grown too attached to the mountains to leave. Colby took up his old position at the blacksmith forge, but the work felt strange in his hands. The rhythm that had once been as natural as breathing now seemed foreign, and he found himself pausing mid-swing to stare out at the peaks with an expression his parents couldn't interpret. "It's like he's listening for something," Martha confided to Samuel one evening as they watched their son standing motionless on the front porch, his attention fixed on the darkening ridgelines. "Or someone," Samuel replied, though he kept that thought to himself. The truth was simpler and more complicated than either of them suspected. War had taught Colby Rain many things: how to kill efficiently, how to endure hunger and cold, and the constant presence of death, how to make life-or-death decisions in the space of a heartbeat. But it had also taught him the value of promises kept and dreams deferred rather than abandoned. In his pack, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, was the tin cup that had become his most treasured possession. Dented by a Confederate rifle ball at Chancellorsville, it had saved his life and served as his dinner plate, water container, and shaving basin through 3 years of campaigning. More importantly, it represented the simple certainty that some things could be counted on, even when everything else fell apart. During the worst moments, crouched in muddy trenches while artillery screamed overhead, marching through Georgia, with Sherman, while farms burned on both sides of the road, lying fevered in a field hospital after Gettysburg, he'd closed his eyes and remembered a green-eyed woman who'd cleaned his wounds with gentle hands and told him to find her when he was older. The memory had become a talisman, something to hold on to when the world dissolved into chaos and brutality. Now, finally old enough and experienced enough to understand what she'd meant, he was ready to honor that long-ago promise. But Cedar Falls felt like a way station rather than a destination, and his parents' careful attempts to reintegrate him into familiar routines only emphasized how completely he'd outgrown the life he'd left behind. The conversations at dinner were stilted, full of subjects they all knew to avoid. His mother would start to ask about battles he'd fought, then catch herself and redirect toward safer topics. His father would begin sharing local gossip, then trail off when he realized how trivial it must sound to someone who'd witnessed entire cities reduced to ash. "You don't have to stay," Samuel said one evening as they worked together at the forge, falling back into the old rhythm of hammer and tongs that required no words to coordinate. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've got the look of a man who's outgrown his surroundings. Same look I had after I came back from my war, before I met your mother and found a reason to put down roots." Colby set down his hammer and studied his father's face. "Are you telling me to leave?" "I'm telling you that staying because you think you should, and staying because you want to, are different things entirely. Your mother and I will be fine. The town will survive whether you're here or not. But if you've got something you need to do, some promise you need to keep, well, a man's word is about the only thing that truly belongs to him." That night, Colby retrieved his journal from the pack he'd brought back from the war. The leather cover was stained and worn, the pages filled with sketches that had nothing to do with military campaigns. Instead, they showed mountain landscapes, wildflowers, and studies of birds in flight, all drawn from memory during quiet moments when his thoughts had turned toward home and the woman who represented everything he'd been fighting to return. On the last page was the letter he'd written before leaving for the war, sealed and yellowed with age, but still unopened. He broke the wax seal and read his younger self's earnest promises, recognizing the boy's idealism, but understanding now what it meant to back such words with action. The next morning, he began making preparations for a different kind of campaign. This time, his objective wasn't a strategic position or enemy stronghold. It was a promise made by a 14-year-old boy to a woman who'd saved him from his own foolishness, and it had waited long enough. Colby's search began where all the stories suggested it should, with the people who lived on the edges of civilization, the homesteaders and trappers and wandering traders who might have encountered a woman living alone in the high country. But tracking someone who'd spent years learning to move unseen required a different approach than anything the army had taught him. His first real lead came from the Hendricks family, Norwegian immigrants who'd carved out a hardscrabble farm in a valley 20 miles north of Cedar Falls. Jonas Hendricks was a pragmatic man who didn't believe in wasting words, but when Colby mentioned Juniper Cade, the farmer's weathered face softened with something approaching reverence. "She saved my youngest daughter's life," Jonas said simply, leading Colby to a wooden bench outside their log cabin. 3 summers ago, little Anna wandered off chasing butterflies and fell into Dead Horse Creek when the spring runoff was running. High current swept her downstream faster than we could follow. He paused to light his pipe, his eyes distant with the memory. Found her 2 miles down, pulled up on a gravel bar, coughing up water, but breathing. And there was this woman sitting beside her, calm as anything, like she'd been waiting for us to arrive. What did she look like? Tall, lean, moved like a cat. Had the greenest eyes I ever saw, and hands that knew healing. She'd gotten all the water out of Anna's lungs and wrapped her in a dry blanket that seemed to come from nowhere. Jonas took a long draw from his pipe, wouldn't take any payment, wouldn't even tell us her name, just asked us to keep quiet about seeing her. Did she say where she was headed? North toward Thunder Lake, but that was 3 years ago, could be anywhere by now. Other stories followed similar patterns. A trapper named Bill Morrison had encountered her during a blizzard that caught him unprepared in the high country. She'd appeared out of the storm like a spirit, led him to a sheltered cave, and shared her fire and food until the weather cleared. By morning, she was gone, leaving only tracks that disappeared at the tree line. Woman knew the mountains better. "Then I know my own cabin," Morrison told Colby over drinks at Murphy's saloon. "Moved through that storm like she could see through the snow. Never seen anything like it." A family of homesteaders near Beaver Creek had a different story, but with the same mysterious ending. Their eldest son had taken sick with fever that wouldn't break, and conventional medicine had failed to help. Then one morning they'd found a bundle of herbs on their doorstep, along with precise instructions for brewing them into a tea. The low fever broke within hours. Neighbors said they saw smoke from a campfire up on Widow's Peak that same night, the boy's mother explained. By the time we climbed up there to thank whoever had helped us, there was nothing left but cold ashes and some flute music floating down from higher up the mountain. The flute music was a detail that appeared in several accounts, always distant and haunting, like birdsong, but more complex. Colby remembered the carved wooden instrument he'd found hanging from a tree branch during one of his teenage expeditions, and began to understand that Juniper Cade had developed her own way of marking territory, not with blazes cut into bark, but with music that carried across the valleys like a signature only those who knew how to listen could recognize. His search took on the methodical patience he'd learned during the war. Instead of trying to follow her current location, he began mapping her historical presence, creating a picture of her movements and preferences that might allow him to predict where she would be, rather than where she had been. The pattern that emerged surprised him with its complexity. She wasn't simply wandering aimlessly through the wilderness. Her movements followed seasonal rhythms tied to resource availability and weather patterns. Lower elevations during harsh winter months, higher country when the snow melted, always. Near reliable water sources, but never in locations that would attract casual visitors. More intriguingly, her appearances to help others weren't random acts of kindness. They followed a logic that suggested she'd been watching, learning the patterns of the scattered families and solitary travelers who moved through her territory. She knew who might need help, and when they were most likely to need it. She's not hiding from people, Colby confided to old Pete during one of his brief returns to Cedar Falls for supplies. She's protecting herself while still being able to help when help is needed. Smart woman, Pete replied, studying the map Colby had drawn showing the locations of various encounters. Question is, what's she protecting herself from? The answer came from an unexpected source. Tom Bradley in Millerville mentioned that a group of loggers from a big timber company had been asking questions about the same woman, but their interest seemed less benevolent than Colby's. Fella named McCready, big Irish bruiser with arms like tree trunks, Bradley explained, said some wild woman had been sabotaging their equipment up near Crystal River, cutting ropes, putting sand in gearboxes, generally making their work impossible. What? A kind of equipment? Logging machinery. Companies got permits to clear-cut about 1,000 acres of old-growth timber up in that country, worth a fortune if they can get it to market, but they're having trouble with more than just equipment failure. Bradley lowered his voice. Word is, their work crews are getting spooked. Tools go missing, strange sounds in the forest at night, feeling like they're being watched all the time. Half their men have quit, and the other half are demanding double wages to stay on the job. That evening, as Colby made camp in a grove of aspens near Crystal River, he heard it for the first time, flute music drifting down from the peaks like wind through the trees, but with a melody that spoke of loneliness and defiance in equal measure. The sound raised goosebumps on his arms and made his heart race with the certainty that he was close, closer than he'd ever been. He didn't call out or try to follow the music. Instead, he built his fire carefully, cooked a simple meal and settled down to wait. If she was watching, and every instinct told him she was, then patience would serve him better than pursuit. The music continued for over an hour, sometimes closer, sometimes more distant, as if the player was moving through the forest in a complex pattern around his camp. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed seemed deeper than ordinary night quiet, pregnant with possibilities and unspoken questions. Colby banked his fire and rolled into his blankets, but sleep was impossible. Somewhere in the darkness above him, Juniper Cade was making decisions that would determine whether 10 years of patient searching would finally lead to the reunion he'd dreamed about, or whether he'd simply become another story she'd tell herself about the world she'd chosen to leave behind. Dawn came with mist rising from the valley floor and the sound of running water somewhere in the distance. Colby woke to find his fire rebuilt and coffee brewing in a battered tin pot he didn't recognize. Fresh trout, cleaned and ready for cooking, lay on a flat rock beside the coals. But there was no sign of whoever had provided this unexpected hospitality. He sat up slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol at his side before he caught himself. This wasn't a battlefield, and the gesture would only communicate distrust. To someone who'd just demonstrated remarkable generosity. "Thank you," he called out to the silent forest, not sure if anyone was listening but needing to acknowledge the kindness. The reply came from directly behind him, so close he could have reached back and touched the speaker. "You always were polite." Colby Rain. He turned slowly, and there she was, exactly as he remembered and completely transformed by the passage of 10 years. Juniper Cade stood with her back to a massive pine tree, rifle held casually but ready, her green eyes studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. She was still tall and lean, still moved with that fluid grace he'd never forgotten, but time had added layers of complexity to her face. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and wind, a small scar along her left cheekbone that hadn't been there before, and a wariness in her posture that suggested hard-won wisdom about trusting strangers. "Hello, Juniper," he said quietly, making no move to rise from his bedroll. "Hello yourself." She stepped closer, but kept the rifle ready. "You've been looking for me for about 6 weeks now, seriously. For 10 years, if I'm being honest. I know. Been watching you stumble around my mountains, asking questions, following old trails." There was amusement in her voice, but also something harder. "Question is why?" Colby considered several answers before settling on the simplest truth. "You told me to find you when I was older. That was a long time ago. You were just a boy then. I'm not a boy anymore." She studied him with those remarkable green eyes, taking in the scars and the weathered look that came from years of hard living. "No, you're not. War changes a man. Among other things. What do you want, Colby?" The question he'd prepared for, the one that had driven him through months of searching, suddenly seemed inadequate when faced with the reality of her presence. He'd imagined this moment countless times, but he'd always pictured it happening differently. A chance meeting on a mountain trail, perhaps, or finding her in some picturesque cabin where she'd welcome him with the same warmth she'd shown that day in Murphy's saloon. "I want to know if you meant what you said," he replied. "Finally, which part? The part about finding you when I was older?" She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze shifting to the mountains that surrounded them. When she looked back, there was something sad in her expression. "Follow me," she said, "but keep quiet and do exactly what I tell you. Where we're going, noise can be dangerous." She led him up a game trail that seemed to exist more in her memory than on the actual landscape, moving with the silent efficiency of someone who'd learned to navigate the wilderness without disturbing it. Colby followed as quietly as he could, his own woodcraft skills feeling clumsy compared to her effortless grace. After an hour of steady climbing, the trail opened into a hidden valley that took his breath away, a natural amphitheater of stone. Walls surrounded a meadow bisected by a clear stream, with a grove of ancient pines providing shelter on the north side. It was the kind of place that existed in dreams, perfectly proportioned, completely secluded, untouched by the complications of the outside world. But it wasn't empty. As they approached the pine grove, Colby caught sight of movement among the trees. His first thought was wildlife, deer perhaps, or elk seeking shelter from the morning sun. Then the movement resolved into something that made him stop walking altogether. Children, 4 of them, ranging in age from maybe 6 to 12, emerging from what looked like a carefully constructed shelter built against the base of an enormous pine tree. They were clean and healthy looking, but their clothes were rough homespun and their feet were bare despite the cool mountain air. "Miss Juniper!" called the youngest. a girl with tangled brown hair and eyes that held more wariness than any 6-year-old should carry. "You brought someone." "It's all right, Mary," Juniper replied, but her voice carried a warning note that made all 4 children freeze where they stood. "This is an old friend. His name is Colby." The children studied him with the careful attention of young animals deciding whether a new presence represented threat or opportunity. The oldest, a boy of maybe 12 with serious eyes and shoulders that already showed the promise of eventual strength, stepped slightly in front of the others, in a protective gesture that was both touching and heartbreaking. "Are you going to make us leave?" the boy asked, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly. "Thomas," Juniper said gently, "nobody's going to make you leave. This is your home." But even as she spoke the reassuring words, Colby could see the conflict in her eyes. His arrival had disrupted something delicate, introduced complications into a situation that had been carefully balanced to protect these children from whatever circumstances had brought them to this hidden valley. "How long have they been with you?" he asked quietly. "Different amounts of time. Mary's been here the longest, almost 2 years. Found her wandering near Beaver Creek after her parents died of fever. Thomas and his sister Ruth came last winter, when their stepfather started using his fists more than his words." She nodded toward the 4th child, a boy of maybe 8, who hung back behind the others. "Little Joe there showed up 3 months ago. His folks were killed by claim jumpers down near Silver Creek." The full implications hit Colby like a physical blow. This wasn't the romantic reunion he'd imagined, with a free-spirited woman ready to resume the flirtation they'd begun 10 years earlier. This was something far more complex and consequential. A woman who'd taken on the responsibility for 4 orphaned children, creating a sanctuary for them in the one place she'd found safety for herself. "They're not just visiting," he said, understanding beginning to dawn. "No, this is their home now. I'm all the family they have left, and you can't just leave them, would you?" The question carried a challenge that went to the heart of what kind of man he'd become during his years away. "Could you walk away from children who have nowhere else to go?" Colby looked at the 4 young faces watching this adult conversation, with the intensity that came from knowing their fate might be decided by words they didn't entirely understand. The youngest girl, Mary, had moved closer to Juniper and taken her hand with the unconscious trust of a child who'd found safety. After experiencing its absence, the romantic fantasy he'd carried for 10 years crumbled and reformed into something more complex and demanding. Juniper Cade wasn't just the wild, free woman of his boyhood dreams. She was a protector, a surrogate mother, someone who'd chosen responsibility over freedom because it was the right thing to do. "No," he said finally, "I couldn't walk away. From them either." For the first time since he'd found her, Juniper's expression softened slightly. "Then you understand the problem." "I understand that things are more complicated than I expected. But that doesn't mean they're impossible, doesn't it? Look around, Colby. This isn't some romantic hideaway where we can play at being mountain folk. This is 4 children who need stability, safety, and a future that doesn't depend on hiding. In the wilderness, forever." As if to emphasize her point, a doll made from scraps of cloth and stuffed with pine needles lay abandoned near the shelter, clearly the work of small hands guided by necessity rather than abundance. It represented everything these children had lost, and everything Juniper was trying to give them back. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made all of them freeze. The distant crack of a tree falling, followed by the mechanical roar of steam-powered equipment echoing up from the valley below. "They're getting closer," Thomas said, his young voice tight with fear. Juniper's face hardened into an expression Colby recognized from his war years, the look of someone preparing for a fight they couldn't avoid. "What's getting closer?" he asked. "McCready's logging crew," she replied grimly. "They've got permits to clear-cut this entire watershed, including this valley." The plot twist Colby hadn't seen coming struck him with the force of a physical blow. He'd found Juniper Cade, but he'd also found her in the middle of a crisis that would force them all to make choices none of them were prepared for. The woman he'd searched for was no longer free to make decisions based only on her own desires. She was responsible for 4 children who depended on her for everything, and their sanctuary was about to be destroyed by forces beyond any of them to control. The boy who'd left Cedar Falls looking for romance had found something far more challenging and meaningful, a chance to prove himself worthy not of a woman's love, but of her trust in the face of impossible odds. The logging company's survey stakes drove into the earth like grave markers, marking out sections of forest that would be reduced to stumps within months. Colby found the first line of wooden stakes while scouting the approaches to the hidden valley, each one bearing the burned initials MTLC, Mountain Territory Logging Company, and GPS coordinates that meant nothing to him but everything to the men who planned to transform this wilderness into board feet and profit margins. "They've surveyed right up to the edge of the valley," he reported back to Juniper, who was teaching little Mary how to identify edible plants, while the other children played a quiet game with stones near the stream. Maybe 2 days of cutting before they reached the entrance to this place. Juniper's hands stilled over the wild onions she'd been showing Mary how to harvest. For a moment, the mask of calm competence she wore for the children's benefit slipped, revealing the fear and exhaustion beneath. "How many men?" she asked quietly. "I counted 12 working the saws, plus supervisors and the camp cook. They've got steam-powered equipment that can drop trees faster than anything I've seen before." He paused, remembering the casual efficiency with which the logging crew had been transforming living forest into naked earth. "These aren't small-time timber cutters, Juniper. This is an industrial operation with serious money behind it." That evening, after the children had been fed and settled for the night in their ingeniously constructed shelter, Juniper and Colby sat by a carefully banked fire and discussed options that all seemed to lead to impossible choices. "We could move deeper into the mountains," Juniper said, but her voice lacked conviction. "There's country up near the Continental Divide that no logging company would want to tackle." "With 4 children? In winter?" Colby shook his head. "Mary's 6 years old, Juniper. Little Joe's barely 8. You might be able to survive conditions that harsh, but they couldn't. Then what do you suggest?" The question he'd been dreading, because the only realistic answer would sound like abandonment to children who'd already lost everything once. "Cedar Falls," he said quietly. "My parents would help. The town's small enough that 4 more children wouldn't strain resources too badly, and no." The word came out flat and final. These children didn't survive what they survived just to be handed off to strangers in some dying mining town. "My parents aren't strangers. The community isn't." "Colby." She turned to face him fully, and in the firelight he could see the depth of her commitment to these 4 young lives. "Do you know what Thomas and Ruth went through before they found me? Their stepfather didn't just use his fists. Ruth still wakes up screaming some nights, and Thomas hasn't spoken about his father's death because he blames himself for not being strong enough to protect his sister." The words hit him like physical blows. "I didn't know." Mary watched her parents die of fever and spent 3 days trying to wake them up before she finally left the cabin and wandered into the forest. "When I found her, she hadn't spoken in weeks, just sat there staring at nothing, like her soul had gone somewhere else entirely." And Joe saw his parents murdered by claim jumpers who wanted their land, hid under the floorboards for 2 days, listening to strangers tear apart everything he'd ever known, then walked 40 miles through mountain country to find help that never came. Juniper poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the stars. "These children don't need another upheaval, another set of strangers making decisions about their lives. They need stability, safety, and people who understand that healing takes time. But if the logging company destroys this valley, then we find another way. But we don't abandon them to the charity of well-meaning folks who've never lived through what they've lived through." Colby studied her face in the firelight, beginning to understand the depth of transformation that had occurred during the years they'd been apart. The free-spirited woman who'd rescued him from a saloon brawl had evolved into something more complex and demanding. A protector whose every decision was filtered through the needs of 4 children who depended on her completely. "Tell me about your husband," he said quietly. The change in her expression was immediate and painful to watch. "That's not a conversation for tonight. Maybe it is. Maybe I need to understand why you chose this life over any other." For a long moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she began speaking in a voice so low he had to lean closer to hear. James Cade was a good man when he was sober, charming, intelligent, everything a woman was supposed to want in a husband. But when he drank, which was most of the time after we married, he became something else entirely. She was quiet for so long he thought she'd stopped, but then she continued. "He never hit me where it would show, always careful about that, always apologetic afterward. Made me feel like it was my fault for not being a better wife, for not understanding the pressures he was under as a military officer." "How long did you stay?" 3 years. 3 years of telling myself it would get better, that he just needed time to work through whatever demons were driving him to drink. Then he got transferred to Arizona Territory, and I thought maybe a change of scenery would help. But it didn't. It got worse. The isolation, the constant threat of Apache raids, the brutal heat, everything that made frontier military service difficult just gave him more excuses to drink and more reasons to take his frustrations out on me. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them in a gesture that made her look younger and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. The night he died, we'd had the worst fight ever. He'd been drinking all day, and when I tried to take the bottle away, he backhanded me hard enough to split my lip and blacken both eyes. Told me I was worthless, that he should have left me in Colorado when he had the chance. What happened? Apache raid hit the fort the next morning. James was still drunk when the alarm sounded, could barely get his gun belt on straight. Took an arrow through the throat in the first 5 minutes of fighting. Her voice was completely emotionless now, as if she was reciting facts about strangers. I should have felt sad or guilty or something. Instead, all I felt was relief. "So you came north, took what little money we had saved, and started walking." "Didn't have a plan, didn't know where I was going, just knew I had to get as far away from that life as possible." She looked at him directly. "That's when I understood what freedom really meant, Colby. Not the romantic idea of it, but the actual weight of being responsible for your own choices and their consequences. And now you're responsible for 4 children. By choice. That's the difference." Her voice carried a strength that hadn't been there when she was talking about her marriage. "Every decision I make for them is mine to make, not something forced on me by someone else's needs or weaknesses or failures." The sound of tree-cutting machinery starting up in the distance interrupted their conversation. The steam-powered saws, roaring to life even before dawn to maximize the working day. The noise seemed obscenely loud in the mountain silence, a mechanical scream that spoke of destruction and irreversible change. "They're working faster than I expected," Colby observed. "McCready's got a deadline. Word is the company promised to have a certain amount of timber cut and shipped before the railroad rates change in January. Every day they fall behind costs them money, which means they won't be willing to negotiate, which means they'll do whatever it takes to finish the job on schedule, including removing any obstacles that get in their way." The implication hung between them like smoke from the fire, obstacles that might include a woman and 4 children who'd made their home in a valley marked for clear-cutting. "There has to be another way," Colby said, but even as he spoke the words, he could hear the desperation in his own voice. "Such as legal action, injunctions, something to delay the cutting until we can find alternatives." Juniper's laugh held, no humor. "You think a logging company with territorial permits is going to be stopped by legal papers filed by a woman who doesn't officially exist and 4 children with no legal guardian?" She had a point. In the eyes of the law, Juniper Cade was a squatter on public land, and the children were vagrants with no legal standing to challenge anything. The logging company held all the advantages: permits, political connections, and the backing of territorial authorities who measured progress in terms of economic development rather than human cost. "Then we make our stand here," Colby said quietly. "Against 12 men with industrial equipment and legal backing, if necessary. You'd do that? Risk everything for children you met today?" He looked toward the shelter where 4 young lives were sleeping peacefully under Juniper's protection, trusting that the adults would find a way to preserve the only safety they'd known in their short, difficult lives. "Wouldn't you?" The question answered itself. They both knew she'd already risked everything for these children, had given up her own freedom and safety to become the family they needed. The only real question now was whether he was prepared to make the same choice, to transform his boyhood promise into something far more complex and demanding than either of them had imagined possible. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the pine trees, illuminating the hidden valley that had become both sanctuary and potential battleground, Colby Rain understood that the search for Juniper Cade had finally ended. Now the real test was about to begin. MacCready arrived with the dawn, flanked by 2 of his crew supervisors, and carrying himself with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to having his orders followed without question. He was everything Tom Bradley had described: broad-shouldered, thick-armed, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work, and the confidence that came from never having to back down from a fight. Colby watched them approach from a concealed position among the rocks above the valley entrance, his hand resting on the grip of his service pistol. Behind him, hidden deeper in the pine grove, Juniper was keeping the children calm and quiet while maintaining her own vigil with the old Spencer rifle she'd carried since her husband's death. "I know you're up there," MacCready called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the natural amphitheater. "Whoever's been sabotaging my equipment, interfering with my crews, this ends today." The logging foreman planted himself in the center of the meadow like he owned it, which, from a legal standpoint, Colby supposed he did. The territorial permits gave Mountain Territory Logging Company the right to harvest timber from this entire watershed, and anyone who interfered with that harvest was technically breaking the law. "I'm giving you one chance to come out and discuss this reasonable-like," MacCready continued. "Otherwise, my boys and I are going to search every inch of this valley until we find you." Colby made the decision before he'd fully thought it through. Standing up from his concealment, he stepped into view with his hands visible but ready. "I'm here," he called back. "Let's talk." MacCready's eyes narrowed as he studied this unexpected figure, a lean, weathered man who moved with the controlled grace of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "You the one been causing my troubles." "Depends what kind of troubles you mean," Colby replied, walking down the slope with measured steps that kept him always in position to dive for cover if necessary. "Cut rope lines, sand in the gearboxes. Tools going missing in the night. My men are spooked half to death, claiming they hear things in the forest that ain't natural." "Maybe your men just aren't comfortable destroying something this beautiful." MacCready's laugh was harsh. "My men are paid to cut trees, not admire scenery, and I got deadlines to meet that don't care about your opinion of beautiful." What if there was another way? Such as? Colby had been hoping to buy time for Juniper to move the children to deeper cover, but MacCready's 2 companions were already spreading out to flank positions that would cut off retreat routes. This wasn't going to be resolved with conversation. Such as finding you timber that's easier to harvest, less remote, closer to transportation routes. "Already got my timber marked and surveyed, thanks. This valley's scheduled for cutting starting tomorrow, and that's exactly what's going to happen. Even if there are families living here." MacCready's expression shifted slightly. "Families? Children, 4 of them, orphaned by circumstances beyond their control. This valley is the only home they have." For a moment, something that might have been uncertainty flickered in the foreman's eyes. Then it hardened into resolve. Territory don't recognize squatters' rights. especially not for vagrants and runaways. If there's children here, they need to be turned over to proper authorities. Anyway. And if they refuse to go, then they'll be removed one way or another. The threat in Macready's voice was unmistakable, and Colby felt his military training taking over. The cold assessment of threats, the calculation of tactical advantages, the shift into a mindset where violence became not just possible, but inevitable. That would be a mistake, he said quietly. Would it? Macready gestured to his companions, who moved closer with the practiced coordination of men who'd worked together in difficult situations. 3 of us, 1 of you, don't see how the arithmetic works in your favor. You're not seeing the whole picture. That's when Juniper stepped out from behind the massive pine tree where she'd been concealed, her late husband's military saber gleaming in the morning light as she held it with practiced ease. The weapon was an unexpected sight. Few women carried swords, and fewer still knew how to use them with the fluid confidence she displayed. Now the arithmetic's different, she said calmly, the saber held in a guard position that spoke of formal training and hard-won experience. Macready's hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip, but stopped when he realized both Colby and Juniper were watching the movement with the kind of attention that suggested they'd been in similar situations before. "Lady, you don't want to do this," Macready said, but his voice had lost some of its swagger. "Don't tell me what I want," Juniper replied, shifting her stance slightly to keep both of Macready's companions in her peripheral vision. "You're the one trespassing on someone's home. Got legal permits that say otherwise. Your permits don't give you the right to threaten children." "What children?" Macready looked around the apparently empty valley. "I don't see any children," as if summoned. By his words, Thomas stepped into view from behind a boulder near the stream. Then Ruth appeared from a different position, followed by little Joe, and finally Mary. They moved with the quiet coordination of young people who'd learned to trust each other completely, forming a loose semicircle that somehow managed to look both vulnerable and determined. Macready stared at them, with an expression that mixed surprise with something that might have been recognition. These weren't the wild, half-civilized waifs he'd expected to find. They were clean, well-fed, and clearly cared for by adults who'd made their welfare the highest priority. "Jesus," one of his companions muttered. "They're just babies. They're squatters on company land," Macready said firmly, but his conviction seemed shaken by the reality of 4 young faces looking at him with a mixture of fear and defiance. "They're children who've already lost everything once," Juniper said, the saber now pointing directly at Macready's chest, "and they're not losing it again." The blade caught the sunlight as she adjusted her grip, and Macready found himself looking at steel that had seen combat use. This wasn't some decorative piece. It was a weapon carried by someone who understood its purpose and wasn't afraid to fulfill it. "You know how to use that thing?" he asked, though the question was clearly rhetorical. "My husband taught me before he died," Juniper replied. "Said a cavalry officer's wife should know how to defend herself when her husband wasn't around to do it for her. And after he died, I kept practicing." The standoff stretched taut as a wire fence, everyone aware that the next words or movements would determine whether this confrontation escalated into violence that would change all their lives forever. Macready's men were getting nervous, shifting their weight and exchanging glances that suggested they weren't entirely comfortable with the turn this situation had taken. In the distance, the sound of steam-powered saws continued their mechanical roar, a reminder that Macready's deadline was real and that time was working against any peaceful resolution. The logging crew would expect their foreman to return with news about when they could begin cutting in this valley, and every hour of delay represented lost profits that would have to be explained to company executives. Colby found himself thinking of the bullet-riddled tin cup in his pack, a reminder that sometimes ordinary objects became extraordinary through the circumstances that shaped them. Looking at these 4 children, he understood that they represented something similar, lives made precious not by what they'd been born with, but by what they'd survived, and the adults who'd chosen to protect them. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the meadow where 6 adults and 4 children faced decisions that would echo through all their futures. The mechanical sound of destruction continued in the distance, marking time like a countdown toward an outcome that none of them could fully predict or control. The violence, when it came, was swift and decisive. Macready's hand moved toward his, a pistol with the practiced speed of a man who'd settled disputes with gunfire before. But Colby had been watching for exactly that movement. His own weapon cleared leather a fraction of a second faster, the army Colt appearing in his hand with the fluid motion that came from months of cavalry training and years of staying alive in situations where hesitation meant death. "Don't, Colby," said quietly, his pistol pointed at Macready's chest. The logging foreman froze with his hand halfway to his gun, recognizing something in Colby's stillness that warned against testing his resolve. Macready's 2 companions had their own weapons half-drawn, but Juniper's Spencer rifle was now aimed directly at the nearest one, and her finger rested on the trigger with the easy familiarity of someone who'd learned to shoot before she'd learned to read. "You're making a serious mistake," Macready said, but his voice lacked the commanding authority it had carried moments before. "Maybe," Colby replied, "but it's our mistake to make. Company's got legal backing. Territorial marshals, if necessary. You can't fight the law with a couple of guns and good intentions. We're not fighting the law. We're protecting our family." The word hung in the mountain air like a declaration of independence. Our family. Not his children or her responsibility, but a unit that included all 6 of them, bound together by choice rather than blood, but no less real for that distinction. "This won't end here," Macready warned, slowly raising his hands away from his weapon. "Company's got deadlines, contracts, investors who expect results. 4 children and a couple of mountain hermits can't stop industrial progress." "Maybe not," Juniper said calmly, "but we can make it expensive enough that your investors start asking questions about cost overruns and schedule delays." For the first time, Macready looked genuinely uncertain. His authority came from his ability to solve problems quickly and efficiently, but this situation was evolving beyond his experience. Armed resistance from squatters wasn't something the logging company had anticipated when they'd planned their harvest schedule. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "Time," Colby replied. "Enough time to relocate safely with guarantees that no one will interfere with the process." How much time?" 2 weeks. "Impossible. We're already behind schedule." 1 week, then," Macready shook his head. "Company won't accept delays. Too much money at stake." "Then we have a problem," Juniper observed, "because we're not leaving today. And you're not cutting timber in this valley while we're still here." The standoff stretched taut as a guitar string, everyone aware that the next decision would determine whether this confrontation escalated into the kind of violence that would bring territorial authorities down on all of them. Macready's men were getting nervous, shifting their weight and exchanging glances that suggested they weren't entirely comfortable with the turn this situation had taken. It was little Mary who broke the impasse, stepping forward from her position, near the stream with the fearless innocence that only 6-year-old children possess. "Are you going to hurt Miss Juniper?" she asked Macready directly, her voice clear and steady, despite the adult tensions swirling around her. Macready stared down at the small girl, with an expression that mixed surprise with something that might have been recognition. Whatever he'd expected to find in this hidden valley, it hadn't been a well-cared-for child asking direct questions about adult conflicts with the kind of trust that suggested she'd never learned to fear strangers. "No, little girl," he said slowly. "Nobody's going to hurt anybody." "Good," Mary replied with 6-year-old certainty, "because Miss Juniper takes care of us, and Mr. Colby is nice, and this is our home." The simple declaration carried more weight than all the legal arguments and territorial permits combined. Macready found himself looking around the valley with different eyes, seeing not just timber to be harvested, but the carefully constructed life that Juniper had built for these 4 children. the shelter that provided warmth and security, the garden plots where they grew vegetables, the carved toys and handmade clothes that spoke of adult attention to childhood needs. "Jesus," he muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. "This is a hell of a thing." "It doesn't have to be," Colby said quietly. "There's got to be compromise possible that serves everyone's interests, such as selective cutting instead of clear cutting. Leave enough timber standing to maintain the ecosystem. Focus on the largest trees that represent the most board feet. Slower process, but higher quality lumber and less environmental destruction." McCready considered this, his practical mind working through the economics. Company wants maximum harvest in minimum time. Company wants maximum profit in minimum time, Juniper corrected. High-quality select-cut timber brings premium prices. Might be worth the extra effort. "And we relocate to where exactly?" "Cedar Falls," Colby said. "Community that would welcome these children, give them schooling and stability while still allowing them to remain together as a family. Under whose authority?" The question that went to the heart of their legal vulnerability. 4 orphaned children being cared for by adults who had no official standing as guardians. "Mine," Colby said quietly, "as their legal guardian and Juniper's husband." The words surprised everyone, including Juniper, who turned to stare at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. But once spoken, they felt right in a way that had nothing to do with legal convenience, and everything to do with the recognition that some commitments transcended romance or personal desire. McCready looked between them, clearly trying to assess whether this unexpected development changed the fundamental dynamics of the situation. "You two are married?" "We will be," Colby replied, meeting Juniper's eyes directly. "If she'll have me." The proposal wasn't what either of them had imagined. Delivered in the middle of an armed confrontation with 4 children as witnesses and a logging foreman as inadvertent matchmaker. But sometimes the most important decisions were made not in moments of careful planning, but in instants when the heart recognized what the mind had been too careful to acknowledge. Juniper studied his face for a long moment, reading the sincerity behind the unexpected words. Then she smiled, not the mysterious expression he remembered from their first meeting, but something warmer and more complex that spoke of partnership rather than romance. "Yes," she said simply, "I'll have you." 6 months later, on a warm spring morning when the wildflowers were blooming in the meadows above Cedar Falls, Colby Rain stood before the small community that had gathered to witness his wedding to Juniper Cade. The ceremony was simple by necessity and choice. A few words spoken by the territorial circuit judge, promises exchanged under a sky so blue it seemed to promise endless possibility, and rings forged by Colby himself from silver he'd panned from the creek that ran behind his father's blacksmith shop. The ring he slipped onto Juniper's finger wasn't elaborate, but it was perfectly fitted and engraved with a pattern of leaves and vines that matched the design on the wooden flute she'd left hanging from a tree branch years earlier. It represented everything their relationship had become. Not the romantic fantasy of his boyhood dreams, but something more complex and durable, built on shared commitment to something larger than themselves. The 4 children stood as witnesses, clean and dressed in their finest clothes, which Martha Rain had spent weeks sewing, with the kind of attention to detail that came from genuine affection. Thomas, now 13, and growing into the young man he would become, held little Mary's hand with protective gentleness. Ruth and Joe flanked them, their young faces serious, with the understanding that this ceremony represented permanence in lives that had known too much uncertainty. "Do you, Colby Rain, take this woman to be your wife, to cherish and protect her, through whatever circumstances life may bring?" "I do," Colby replied, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. This wasn't just a marriage ceremony, it was the formal recognition of a family that had been forged through crisis and tempered by mutual commitment to 4 children who needed adults willing to put their welfare above personal convenience. Do. You, Juniper Cade, take this man to be your husband, to stand with him as partner and equal through all the challenges ahead? I do, Juniper answered, and her voice carried the strength that had sustained her through years of wilderness living and the gentle authority that had transformed 4 damaged children into a family. The kiss that sealed their marriage was brief and sweet, witnessed by a community that had learned to measure success not in terms of individual achievement, but in terms of how well people took care of each other when circumstances demanded sacrifice. Samuel and Martha Rain had surprised everyone, including themselves, with how naturally they'd adapted to having 4 additional grandchildren to worry about and spoil. Martha's general store had become an unofficial gathering place for the children after school, where they helped with inventory and learned practical skills while being fed cookies and stories about their adoptive father's childhood adventures. Samuel had taken Thomas under his wing at the blacksmith shop, teaching him the ancient art of shaping metal with fire and patience. The boy showed natural aptitude for the work, but more importantly, he'd found in Samuel the kind of steady, reliable male guidance that his traumatic early experiences had taught him to distrust. Ruth had blossomed under Martha's gentle attention, learning to read and write with voracious enthusiasm while helping tend the garden that provided vegetables for both households. Her nightmares had gradually faded, replaced by the kind of ordinary childhood concerns that spoke of healing and growing confidence. Little Joe had appointed himself the town's unofficial wildlife expert, spending his free time cataloguing birds and small animals with the passionate intensity that only 8-year-old boys could bring to such endeavors. Old Pete Hutchins had become his mentor in woodcraft and natural history, delighting in having someone who shared his fascination with the intricate workings of mountain ecosystems. And Mary, the youngest and in many ways the most resilient, had simply accepted her new life with the adaptability that children possess when they finally find adults they can trust completely. She helped her new grandmother in the store, played elaborate games with her adoptive siblings, and seemed to regard Colby and Juniper's marriage as the natural culmination of events that had always been leading toward this outcome, the compromise. With Mountain Territory Logging Company had worked better than anyone expected. McCready's suggestion of selective cutting had indeed produced higher quality timber that commanded premium prices, offsetting the slower harvest schedule. More importantly, the preserved forest canopy had maintained the watershed's ecological balance, ensuring that the streams continued flowing clear and the wildlife populations remained stable. The hidden valley where they'd made their stand had been designated as a protected area in perpetuity, partly through Colby's connections with territorial authorities who remembered his military service, but mostly through McCready's quiet influence with company executives who preferred positive publicity about environmental stewardship to negative stories about displacing orphaned children. As the wedding guests dispersed into the warm afternoon, Colby and Juniper found themselves standing alone for the first time since the ceremony, watching their 4 children chase butterflies in the meadow behind the church. "Any regrets?" Colby asked, taking her hand and feeling the unfamiliar weight of the ring he'd made for her. "About which part?" Juniper replied, with the slight smile that had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. "Marrying you, or agreeing to live. In a town with actual neighbors and social expectations, either, both." She considered the question seriously, her gaze moving from the children to the mountains that surrounded Cedar Falls like protective walls. "I spent so many years thinking that freedom meant being alone, answering to nobody but myself," she said finally. "It took 4 children and a stubborn man who kept a 10-year-old promise to teach me that the best kind of freedom comes from choosing the people you want to be responsible to, even when those people include a 6-year-old who thinks vegetables are optional and a 13-year-old who's convinced he knows everything about everything, especially then." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching Thomas attempt to teach Mary the finer points of butterfly identification, while Ruth and Joe built an elaborate fort from fallen branches. The scene was perfectly ordinary and completely extraordinary. The kind of everyday miracle that happened when adults chose to put children's needs ahead of their own convenience. "Do you think they'll be all right?" Junby asked. "Really all right, I mean. Despite everything they went through before?" "I think they'll be better than all right," Colby replied, remembering his own childhood certainty that some promises were worth keeping no matter how long it took or how much the keeping cost. "I think they'll understand something about family that most people never learn, that it's not about blood or law or accident of birth. It's about choosing each other every day, even when it's difficult." As if to prove his point, Mary looked up from her butterfly studies and waved at them with the unconscious happiness of a child who knew herself to be loved and protected. Behind her, the mountains rose toward a sky that promised fair weather for the journey ahead, whatever that journey might bring. Some promises, Colby reflected, were worth a lifetime of keeping, and some people were worth finding, no matter how long the search took, or how different the finding turned out to be from what you'd originally imagined. The boy who'd fallen in love with a wild mountain woman had become a man who'd learned that love was less about possession than about partnership, less about romance than about commitment to something larger and more demanding than individual desire. The story that had begun with a 14-year-old's foolish declaration in a frontier saloon had evolved into something richer and more complex. A family built by choice rather than chance, sustained by mutual commitment to 4 young lives that needed adults willing to put their welfare above personal convenience, and in the end, that turned out to be the only story worth telling.